Gerald had always been a stretch. Francis and Gerald had lived side by side since childhood, and since the first grade, he had carried her briefcase to and from school. He did it quietly. Francis always laughed. "Gerald, why are you always so quiet?" He just sniffed his nose and asked, "Well, what is there to say?" Francis laughed and said, "Yes, you'd better be quiet." Gerald was quiet. He just sniffed louder than usual. As Francis grew older and began to lead a rambunctious life, Gerald's mother just sighed. "Why can't you find yourself a good girl, son? This Francis is sluttish. You can't have a true family life with her." But Gerald just snorted and continued to accompany Francis. When she was in the club, he waited for her outside. Even if the girl goes out with some guy, Gerald would follow them. Francis had even thrown her fists at him more than once. "Leave me alone, my patience snapped. You're always following me and scaring my boys." Gerald didn't look at her and said, "They're bad people. You don't need them." "And who are the good guys then? You? You're a coward." Gerald was offended, but he didn't show it. And then he joined the army. It was hard for him there. He tried to keep busy so he wouldn't have to think about Francis. He spent all his free time at the gym. Gerald came back from the army as handsome as from the cover of a magazine. Girls were paying attention on him, flirting all the time, showing signs of affection. But all he wanted to do was see Francis. And Francis was excited too. She suspected being pregnant. It wasn't certain, but still, somehow it was happening. She'd had a dangerous period 2 weeks ago, and she wasn't using contraception. That's where Francis and Gerald came in. It only took a minute to seduce him, especially since Gerald looked like a real man now. After a few times together, a month later, Francis confessed to him that she was late. And Gerald was very happy. He could not believe his happiness. The mother cried and cried. "It is not your child. Remember my word. The child is not yours. Don't ruin your life. Don't marry her." But even in childhood, Gerald was particularly stubborn. So his mother accepted and began to prepare for the wedding. Francis gave birth to a baby girl. She was a tiny and really beautiful child. Gerald rocked her gently with his big hands, washed diapers, cooked porridge. Francis was tired, even exhausted. Therefore, she needed to rest. And Francis did get tired. When Gerald worked nights, she asked a neighbor to watch Renee. Francis herself would go out to the bars and restaurants to hang out. In the morning, she would come home and go to bed. Of course, how would she have the energy to take care of her daughter? Gerald knew everything, but he kept quiet. He was afraid that Francis would run off with another man and take his daughter with her. Gerald loved her very much. He was afraid he would never see Francis again. After a while, Francis calmed down. She stopped living a promiscuous life, and Gerald even began to go easy. He told his mother that things were getting better, but she just shook her head. Gerald's mother was very attached to Renee. She did not know even why. She had many doubts, but how could she not love such an angel? She tried to take her home with her when Gerald worked at night. She didn't want the bitch of a son's wife to leave her granddaughter alone. The woman reasoned that the father was the one who raised the child, so she calmed down a bit. All her love went to Renee. One day, Gerald came home from work. His Francis was sitting there with a suitcase in front of her. Gerald's heart was heavy, and she looked at him and cried. "Forgive me, Gerald. You know, I never loved you, and now I have fallen in love with another man. I'm so much in love that my breast burns with fire. I'm leaving you. I'm going to him. He's waiting for me. I just have to go and get Renee." Gerald looked at her for a long time, thinking about something. Then he said quietly, "I'm not giving you Renee. You don't have to drag the kid around the joints. I can handle her myself." Francis even jumped up. "How can you give her to me? Renee is my daughter. I can't live without her. Gerald pounded his fist on the table so hard that one of the legs broke. If you want to live a rebellious life at all, then go away, and I won't have you dragging our daughter through brothels. Frances, though frightened, tried to speak to her husband again. It was so unlike Gerald. He gave her such a look that she ran out into the street without looking back and quickly got into a taxi. Gerald sat for a while. Then he got up and went to his mother's house. As soon as he opened the door, Renee jumped into his arms. "Daddy's home! Hooray!" Mom knew something was wrong. "Where's Frances?" "Renee, go put your toys in your backpack. We're going home soon." The girl ran off and Gerald looked at his mother. "She's gone." "Gone where and why?" "Gerald, what kind of person are you? I have to get every word out of you." "I don't know where she went. I know for sure that she is with a suitor." The mother suddenly sat down. "What friend? And why you talk about it so calmly? What about Renee?" "I didn't give her Renee. You will help me, won't you?" "Yes, of course I will, but how come?" "Well, she said she never loved me, that she had feelings for another man for a long time. Her soul is on fire." "Her soul is on fire somewhere else." Renee came into the kitchen. "Dad, I'm ready." "That's good. Let's go home now, and tomorrow I have the day off. Let's go to the park and ride the merry-go-round." "Yay! And Mom?" "Mom had to go to work. She's on a business trip." Renee was upset at first, but immediately found her advantage. "So I get Mom's share of the ice cream?" Gerald's mother, who had just wiped away her tears, immediately laughed. "How clever you are, Renee." As they turned to leave, his mother touched his hand. "Gerald, what are you going to do? To get a divorce?" "Yes, I'm sick of it." "That's right. Vanessa has been asking about you again." "Mom, don't bring that up again." "That's it. I'm shutting up." Gerald put Renee in the car, got behind the wheel, and drove out of the yard. On the way, he thought about Vanessa for some reason. Vanessa was the daughter of his mother's boyfriend. She had been alone since 18 years, as that time her mother died. The girl was small, like a gray mouse. She was very inconspicuous. There is a type of person who, whether out of insecurity or habit, always stays in the shadows and never speaks. Vanessa was such a person. Even when she was little, she never participated in the general noisy games. She was always watching from the sidelines. Now Gerald tried, but he couldn't even remember her face. Of course, she was a far cry from Frances's beauty. Gerald and Renee started living together. But why two? Gerald's mother helped them a lot. The mother had recently retired and had a lot of free time. Renee asked about her mother at first, and then she stopped. Gerald even began to settle down, to get used to his loneliness. He quit his job and started his own small business. Strangely enough, the business was an instant success. People recognized Gerald as honest, as a man who always kept his word, and they liked to use his company's services. 2 years passed. One Sunday afternoon, Gerald and Renee went out to the backyard. The girl went to the swing set, and Gerald went to work on the bar. He didn't immediately see the woman with the baby in her arms looking at him. As soon as he saw the woman, Gerald was shocked. Standing in front of him was Frances. She was poorly dressed, with a small boy in her arms. "Gerald, forgive me. Don't send me away. I can't wander anymore. Brian is hungry, and we've been living in the courtyards for a month. I'm ashamed to show my face to you." It was then that Renee realized who was standing in front of her. "Mommy!" The little girl did not run to her. She took her father's hand and looked pleadingly into his eyes. It was morning outside. There were no people. But Gerald noticed that almost all the neighbors were staring at them from their windows. Some even opened their windows to better hear the conversation. "Let's go home. Don't make people laugh here. We'll talk face to face." It was only after these words that Renee ran to her mother. Frances cried, kissed, and hugged Renee. "In the apartment," Gerald said. "Feed the baby, put it to bed, then we'll talk." Frances made porridge and fed Brian. He was 6 months old, no more. Gerald watched in silence. When the boy fell asleep, content and contented, Renee stayed with him, and Frances returned to the kitchen. She sat down in a chair in front of Gerald. "My husband left me. He promised me loads of gold, but first he became alcoholic, then he hit me, and then after Brian was born, he disappeared. Then he showed up a month ago with his new wife. He threw us out on the street. Gerald, I know there's no forgiveness from me. No, please don't tell, I beg you. I'll be like your faithful dog. I'll do whatever you say. I have nowhere to go. My brother has my parents' apartment, and you know he will not let me out of the door." Gerald was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You will stay in the small room for now, and what happens after that we will decide later." Time passed. Somehow, without anyone noticing, Frances moved into the master bedroom. They began to live as before, only the family grew. Brian grew up and called Gerald Daddy. Renee went to school. Gerald's mother didn't visit for a long time. She called her son a fool and Frances a whore. When Renee was in 2nd grade, Gerald found out that his wife was cheating on him again. He was surprised. Of course, he noticed that at first she was very interested in the kids, but then she grew cold to them. She only got nervous when she had to deal with them. Gerald was silent, just watching. And then he came home a few times while the children were in kindergarten and school. Frances was gone. But in the evening she said she had been home all day. Gritting his teeth, Gerald hired a private investigator. Within a week, he had lots of pictures of Frances with her lover. Gerald drove to his yard. It was getting dark. There was no one in the yard. He didn't want to go home. He just didn't know what to do. He took a bottle of whiskey out of the trunk, sat down in the arbor, and started drinking. He drank and thought about how his life had turned out. "May I join you?" He jumped in fright. A young woman stood before him. She was vaguely familiar. It was Vanessa, the one who had always been in love with him. "Sit down. Why aren't you sleeping?" "I can't. And then I saw you in the window, so I came down." "Why are you drinking?" "Ouch, don't even ask." "Frances, you shouldn't do it. You'll get drunk, and then you'll do something you'll regret later." "No, I won't." "Why are you sad?" They sat with Vanessa in the pavilion until almost morning. They remembered things, talked about things. Gerald felt so at ease, as if everything around him had become clearer. He came home and lay down quietly on the couch in the living room. He didn't want to see Frances, to hear her breathing. Frances didn't go anywhere for a week. Gerald's absence that night had sobered her a little. She asked at length where he was, what he was doing, but Gerald replied that he was spending his time at work and not getting into any scandals. He couldn't get over Vanessa. She was like a mouse, but there was something about her that Frances didn't have. Some honesty, some kindness. A few weeks later, he came home and Frances was gone. Renee had the idea to call Granny, who took Brian out of the garden. Gerald became very sad. He knew where his wife was, but he didn't know what to do. His mother had to go. They were out to see her off, and in the yard they met Vanessa again. The girl was embarrassed, blushing, and Gerald, not knowing how it happened, said, "Vanessa, why don't you come with us to the cafe right now?" Vanessa was confused and then looked at him. "Come on, let's go." The kids jumped up and down in excitement. At the cafe, Gerald ordered almost everything on the menu. They were having a great time. And he kept watching Vanessa. He watched as she talked to Brian, teaching him how to eat his cake so the crumbs didn't fall off. Then she answered some questions for Renee, and in general, Vanessa was very domestic, proper, and most importantly, which for some reason Gerald had not noticed before, Vanessa was very beautiful. If Frances's beauty was flashy, flamboyant, Vanessa's was subtle and inner. When the woman looked at him and smiled slightly, Gerald saw her blossom. Did she really still love him? That was impossible. But it was as if she were single. "Vanessa, forgive me for asking an indiscreet question. Where is your husband?" "I have no husband and never had." Gerald asked like a complete idiot. Why? Vanessa was embarrassed, and Renee poked him in the side with her hand. Daddy, you can't ask a woman questions like that. Gerald realized he had said something stupid. He started to apologize, but Vanessa had already responded. Why do you ask? You know the reason. Now it was time for Gerald to be embarrassed. He hadn't expected such frankness from the girl. The evening somehow ended on its own. When they got home, Frances was already in the kitchen doing something. She looked at Gerald guiltily, expecting a scandal. But he was silent. He walked silently into the room and lay silently on the couch. For 3 days, Frances was quiet. But on the 4th day, she began to make a fuss. Gerald was home that day, so there was no way she could leave during the day. He saw it all, understood it all, and watched with interest to see what would happen next. Nothing wavered in his heart. Everything was suddenly extinguished, as if there were no feelings at all. It was as if his eyes had been opened when he saw the pictures of Frances having fun with her lover. He knew, always knew, that this would happen. He knew that Renee was probably not his daughter either. But that didn't matter now. Both Renee and Brian were his children, and he would never give them up to anyone else. Gerald thought more and more about Vanessa. He wondered if he had paid attention to her back then, what would have happened? How would his life have turned out? And hers? They would have had many children. He saw that Vanessa enjoyed spending time with the little ones, and he adored the little ones in general. Renee came over, sat down next to him on the couch, and hugged him. Dad, Mom is so mean. She yells at us. Gerald grinned. Of course she was mad. She had to go to her lover's, and there was no way she could leave the house. Renee, don't mind. How nice it was when it was just the two of us. I wish we could live like that now, with Brian, of course. She yells at him, too. Gerald looked at his daughter intently. Strange that he hadn't thought of that. Brian was crying again, and Gerald heard Frances yelling at him again. He went to the kitchen and picked up the boy. He tucked her in and told her the story himself. Then he went into the kitchen. Frances hadn't seen him yet. He stopped and noticed her putting some pills in her tea. The man raised an eyebrow, took a step back, then acted as if he had just walked in. Frances seemed pleased with him. Oh, Gerald, I was going to follow you. Let's have a cup of tea together. I have a headache today. Maybe tea will help. She held up the cup into which she had poured the pills. Was she really going to poison him? Come on, she wouldn't stoop to that. Then what was she planning? Probably sleeping pills. As soon as Frances turned her back to the stove, he poured the tea into the flour. Sorry, Flower, it must be hot for you. Frances looked at his cup in surprise. Oh, I was really thirsty. Well, I'd better go. I'm tired. Frances gave him a satisfied look. Gerald lay in the dark, listening to what was going on in the kitchen. Suddenly he heard her telephone ring. She spoke softly and quickly, then came into the room. Gerald! Gerald! But he was silent, pretending to be asleep. Frances went out, and a minute later, he heard the front door open softly. Gerald got up and went to the window. Frances was getting into a taxi. Well, that was it. Now he must have time to do what we had planned. Careful not to wake the children, Gerald gathered Frances's things. Then he placed the 2 suitcases and the bag on the landing. He put her passport on top, and inside the passport he put the photographs the detective had brought him. Then he went and lay down. Strangely enough, he fell asleep very quickly. The man was awakened by the bell. He got up quickly and opened the door. On the threshold stood Frances with frightened eyes. Gerald, I can explain everything. I love you very much. It was a mistake. It was just a mistake. Don't call. You'll wake the children. And be nice. Don't come back into my life. Gerald closed the door. Frances looked at the door with utter horror in her eyes. Where would she go now? What would she do? She knew very well that Gerald was only temporarily calm and slow. The woman decided that she had to give him time to calm down and miss him, and then try to make up again. She dialed her lover's number. Hello? My husband kicked me out. I'm coming to your place. Are you crazy? Why are you here? My wife will be back in 2 days. Solve your problems on your own." There were short beeps on the receiver. Francis didn't understand. He had sworn that he loved her very much, that he didn't want to be with her anymore. After 3 months of unbearable life in a rented room, Francis decided it was time to go back home. Enough time had passed for everyone to forgive and miss her. Francis went to see her brother. He would not let Francis in the front door. He'd been offended since he was a young man when Francis had persuaded their grandmother to sign the apartment over to her. Then, just as quietly, she sold it and spent all the money. He told her sisters not to go back, not even to hope for anything. Francis had to borrow money from her friends and rent a room with bed bugs. Francis didn't even think about getting a job. Gerald never sent her to work and always provided for her family. There was no more money. It was a good time to go back to the house where she was always comfortable. Francis approached the house. Gerald's car was gone. Maybe it was for the best. Now she'd cook something nice and clean up. The place must be dusty by now, and tonight she would meet Gerald and ask for forgiveness. She tried to open the door, but the key didn't fit. This was something new. Had he really thought about changing the lock? Francis began to get angry. Well, nothing. As soon as she made up her mind, she would get the keys to the new lock. The woman started ringing and knocking, but no one answered. The neighbor's door creaked open. "Francis, what are you doing here? Where's Gerald? Do you know?" "I know. He's at the seaside." "The seaside?" Francis actually choked with anger. She thought he was worried, but he was at sea? "And where are the children?" "And the children are with him, and the new wife is also with him." The neighbor slammed the door without waiting for Francis to ask more questions. It was enough for her to see the woman's twisted face. She'd never liked the wild woman, so she always felt sorry for Gerald. And Francis stood there, unable to move from her seat. What woman? What new wife? Had he lost his mind? How she would scold him when he came back, and he would regret having been born at all. And then a wonderful thought came to Francis. We should report him to the police for stealing her children. They are legally divorced, so he had the right to take them anywhere without her consent. We just need to talk to his mother first. Have her call him and talk to him. If he doesn't come back and forgive her, she'll file a police report. She went to Gerald's mother's house. The woman opened the door. "What do you want?" "I want to talk." "There's nothing to talk about." "I'm going to report Gerald and call the police because he stole the kids without my knowledge." "Well, call them. I'll look into it." Francis grabbed the phone and began to cry into the phone that her husband had stolen the children and his mother was supporting and protecting him. Gerald's mother watched her with interest. Then she said, "Well, come on. We don't want the police waiting at the door." Francis did not understand why she was so calm. Nevertheless, she went in and sat down. Soon the police arrived. Francis immediately began to cry, though she had to pinch herself painfully to make the tears flow. All of her statements were recorded, and then they turned to Gerald's mother. "Why are you helping to hide the children?" "From who? From her?" "No one is hiding them. Gerald, my son, is on vacation with his wife and children, and that woman is his ex-wife. By the way, she lost her parental rights 2 weeks ago." The woman took out her papers and gave them to the police. They looked through everything and turned to Francis, who was looking at the whole thing with crazy eyes. "Why are you acting like this, woman? You abandoned your own children and now you're making a scene." How have I been deprived?" "Well, we sent you letters several times, and since you were evicted from your apartment, they came to the address where you used to live. You did not show up. There are many statements from neighbors and even from private investigators." "I won't leave it like this. You arranged everything. You will cry and beg me for mercy. How will I live now?" Gerald's mother looked at her and said, "Serves you right, prostitute. People work to live and you don't know that. Is that what you missed? Gerald did everything for you." The police escorted her out of the apartment and warned her that next time they would take her away for a report. Francis threw up her hands and walked away. She thought she needed a plan to get Gerald back. On her way, she stopped at a pawn shop and pawned the earrings Gerald had once given her. The money she got was enough to pay for her room and buy food. That's okay, she'll wait. Frances walked to Gerald's house every day. Finally, she sat in the yard for the third hour. She saw his car pull up into the yard. Frances fixed her hair and got up to meet him. Gerald was the first to get out of the car. He helped Vanessa out. She'd seen this girl somewhere before. Surely she had lived in this courtyard. How she had changed. She was unrecognizable. She looked so much prettier. Then the kids got out of the car. Renee noticed them at once. Frances smiled and the girl hid behind her father. Then she tugged on his sleeve. "Dad, look." Gerald turned. His eyes narrowed in anger. He walked toward Frances. He grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a bush before Brian could see her. Vanessa saw the look in Gerald's eyes and told Renee to quickly take her brother home and rushed after her husband. Gerald was furious. He rarely lost his temper, but this was one of those times. "I told you not to show your face. I'm here for the children. You never wanted those children, and now that you have nothing, you suddenly remember them?" He squeezed her hand tighter and tighter. Suddenly, Vanessa ran up. "Gerald, leave her alone. Let's go home." And then Frances became hysterical. She ripped Gerald's arm off and threw herself at Vanessa, grabbing her hair and scratching her. Gerald barely pulled her away from his wife and threw her aside. At that moment, the children ran up to them. They hugged Vanessa and all screamed, "Are you in pain? Are you in pain? Let me blow." Vanessa tried to calm them down by sitting on the floor. "No, Sunshine, it's okay. It's just a scratch." Blood ran down Vanessa's cheek. Frances watched the scene with hatred, then said, "Renee, Brian, come here. I am your mother. I missed you." But the children didn't move. They didn't even look at her. Then she raised her voice. "I told you to get away from that aunt and come to your mother. Do you hear me?" Renee turned to her and said, "Go away. Don't touch our Vanessa. Go away." "What do you say to your mother? You lousy girl. I haven't scolded you enough. Brian, go to your mother. It's not even your daddy." Gerald couldn't take it anymore. He turned to her and said, "I'm going to give you 2 minutes. If you're there in 2 minutes, I promise you, you're in trouble." Frances backed away from his gaze, then took a step toward him and hissed, "You'll be sorry." That evening, the whole family gathered in the kitchen, and Grandma came. She hadn't seen her grandchildren for a long time. The children gave her shells from the sea and small gifts they had bought from street vendors. They did not talk about what had happened during the day. Renee and Brian excitedly told Grandma how much fun they had at the ocean and how wonderful the waves and hot sun were. She listened and smiled. It was getting dark outside, and it was time to go home. Suddenly, there was a noise outside, and then it was light. Everyone ran to the window. Gerald's car was on fire. The neighbors moved their cars as best they could, but the cars next to them also caught fire. Vanessa yelled, "Why are you standing there?" "What am I going to do? There's nothing left to save." "Is it over?" "I think so. I've done the insurance. I might have forgiven her, but the neighbors. We put a camera in the driveway a month ago. It's pointed right at the cars." Frances celebrated her success. She bought a bottle of champagne with the last of her money. She opened it, sat down on the couch, and drank straight from the bottle. She smiled. This was only the beginning. Now she would think of something else. The doorbell rang. Strange. Who could it be? She opened it and saw the policeman. "What do you want?" "Come in. We're here for you." "For me? What's wrong?" "Well, in case you didn't know, it's against the law to burn cars." "I didn't burn anything. It caught fire by itself." Frances stopped. No, not again. She can't go to jail. And for what? She was the one who had been cheated, who had been thrown out of the house. But no one listened to the woman's pleas. When she tried to push the policeman away and clawed at his face with her nails, she was handcuffed and told that her sentence would be increased. 1 year later, Vanessa and Gerald had a daughter. Renee examined her carefully when the girl was brought home from the maternity hospital. Then she let Brian down and told him, "You're not the youngest anymore. That means you can't be spoiled anymore. Here, she is a little one and you have to protect her and play with her." Brian thought for a while. He wanted to fool around, but he wanted to be a big brother even more, and then he said, "Okay, I'll protect her." Everyone in the room laughed.